Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in California. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1849 in California brought more than just the usual seasonal changes to the Sacramento Valley. As thousands of fortune seekers descended upon the region in pursuit of gold, the landscape itself seemed to shift under the weight of ambition and desperation. Among the established families who had watched their pastoral world transform overnight was the Ortega family, whose sprawling ranch sat on what is now the outskirts of modern-day Stockton, then nothing more than a collection of tents and hastily constructed buildings serving the endless stream of prospectors. The Ortegas had been granted their land under the Mexican land grant system in 1834, a generous tract of nearly 8,000 acres that stretched from the San Joaquin River to the foothills of what would later be called the Coast Range. The family patriarch, Joaquin Ortega, had built a substantial adobe house in the Spanish colonial style, complete with thick walls that provided relief from the valley's intense summer heat and bitter winter winds. The structure was designed around a central courtyard, with rooms branching off in the traditional manner and a separate building that served as both kitchen and storage for the family's considerable wealth. By all accounts, the Ortegas had adapted well to California's transition from Mexican to American territory following the war. Unlike many of their contemporaries who lost their holdings to legal challenges or were simply overwhelmed by the changing political landscape, Joaquin had proven remarkably adept at navigating the new legal system. He spoke fluent English, maintained cordial relationships with the American officials who had assumed control of regional governance, and had even begun the process of obtaining formal title to his land under the new territorial laws. The family consisted of Joaquin, his wife Esperanza, and 3 adult members of their household, whose exact relationships remain somewhat unclear in the surviving records. There was Remedios, described in contemporary documents as either Esperanza's sister or perhaps a cousin, a woman in her early 30s who had never married and devoted herself to managing the domestic affairs of the ranch. Then there was Cornelius Webb, an American of Irish descent who had arrived in California in 1847 and somehow became integrated into the Ortega household, possibly as a result of a business partnership with Joaquin, though the exact nature of their relationship was never formally documented. The 5th permanent resident was Valentin Herrera, a vaquero who had worked for the family since the early days of the ranch. Herrera was known throughout the region for his skill with horses and his absolute loyalty to the Ortegas, having turned down numerous offers of employment from other landowners who sought to recruit experienced cattlemen during the chaotic period following American annexation. What made the Ortega case particularly unusual was not just the mysterious circumstances of their disappearance, but the meticulous way in which their absence was discovered and documented. On November 15, 1849, a circuit judge named Ambrose Kettner was traveling through the San Joaquin Valley to conduct hearings in various settlements when he stopped at the Ortega Ranch, as was his custom when passing through the area. Kettner maintained detailed journals throughout his career, and his account of that day provides one of the most complete contemporary records of what he found. According to Kettner's journal, he approached the ranch house in the late afternoon, expecting the usual warm reception he had received during previous visits. The Ortegas were known for their hospitality, and Esperanza in particular had gained a reputation for her cooking among travelers who frequented the valley routes. However, as Kettner's party drew closer to the main building, they were struck by an unusual silence that seemed to envelop the entire property. The judge noted that the ranch typically bustled with activity during daylight hours. Herrera would normally be visible, working with the horses in the corral or moving cattle in the distant pastures. Remedios could usually be seen tending to the vegetable garden that flourished behind the main house, or hanging laundry on the lines that stretched between the olive trees Joaquin had planted in the Spanish style. But on this particular afternoon, nothing moved except the wind pushing tumbleweeds across the dusty courtyard. Kettner dismounted and called out a greeting in Spanish, then waited for the customary response. When none came, he approached the front entrance and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed strangely in the courtyard, as if the buildings themselves were somehow holding their breath. After several minutes, with no response, the judge tried the door and found it unlatched, swinging open with a prolonged creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The interior of the house was immaculate, as if prepared for guests who never arrived. The main room was arranged exactly as Kettner remembered from his previous visits, with the heavy furniture that Joaquin had commissioned from craftsmen in Monterey, positioned around the edges of the space, and the brightly colored rugs that Esperanza had woven covering the packed earth floor. On the wooden table in the center of the room, a meal had been set for 5 people, with plates, cups, and utensils arranged in perfect order. The food itself had long since spoiled, but the arrangement suggested that the family had been expecting to dine together when something interrupted their routine. Judge Kettner's party conducted a thorough search of the property, examining each building and scanning the surrounding areas for any sign of the missing family. In the stable, they found the horses in their stalls, adequately fed and watered, as if someone had been caring for them recently, yet clearly distressed by the prolonged absence of their handlers. The cattle were scattered across the far pastures, but appeared to be in good condition, suggesting they had not been abandoned for more than a few days. More puzzling was what they discovered in the family's private quarters. In the bedroom that Joaquin and Esperanza shared, their personal belongings remained undisturbed, including valuable items such as silver jewelry and a small collection of gold coins that Joaquin kept in a wooden chest beside their bed. Esperanza's clothes hung neatly in the wardrobe, and her personal effects were arranged on the dressing table exactly as one might expect to find them during a temporary absence, not the hasty departure that circumstances might suggest. The judge's investigation revealed no signs of struggle or violence. Doors and windows throughout the house were secure, and none of the family's possessions appeared to have been disturbed by intruders. Most significantly, there was no evidence that the family had prepared for travel or intended to leave the ranch. Their wagon remained in the barn, along with all the tack and equipment necessary for a journey, and the large leather bags they typically used for transporting goods to the settlements were hanging in their usual places. What troubled Kettner most deeply, and what he documented extensively in his journal, was a discovery he made in the ranch office where Joaquin conducted his business affairs. On the desk, partially hidden beneath some papers, was what appeared to be a map drawn in Joaquin's distinctive handwriting. The map showed the ranch property in considerable detail, including landmarks and geographic features that would not normally be of interest to a cattle operation. More disturbing still were the numerous X marks scattered across the drawing, each accompanied by dates spanning the previous 6 months, and what appeared to be measurements or distances written in a combination of Spanish and numbers. Kettner was an educated man who had studied surveying before entering law, and he recognized immediately that the markings on Joaquin's map indicated some kind of systematic excavation or search pattern across the ranch property. The dates suggested that this activity had been ongoing since early spring, beginning shortly after rumors began circulating that gold had been discovered in the American River, about 80 miles to the northeast. The pattern of the markings seemed to focus particularly on areas near the creek that ran through the southern portion of the ranch, and around several natural rock formations that dotted the landscape. The judge made copies of the map and included them in the report he filed with territorial authorities in Sacramento, but the document apparently disappeared from official files sometime during the administrative chaos that characterized California's early statehood period. The only record of its contents comes from Kettner's personal journal, which was discovered in 1962 during the renovation of his family's home in San Francisco, nearly 40 years after his death. In the days following Kettner's discovery of the abandoned ranch, word of the Ortega family's disappearance spread rapidly throughout the region, carried by the constant stream of prospectors and traders who moved through the valley. The story took on different characteristics, with each telling, as often happens when facts become entangled with speculation and the human tendency to find explanations for the inexplicable. Some who had known the family suggested that Joaquin had simply decided to relocate to a more secure location, possibly Mexico, taking his wealth with him to avoid the increasing lawlessness that plagued many parts of California during the gold rush period. This theory gained credence from the fact that several other established California families had indeed abandoned their properties during this period, either because of legal challenges to their land titles or simply because the social upheaval had made their traditional way of life impossible to maintain. However, those who knew Joaquin well found this explanation unconvincing. Unlike some of his contemporaries who had struggled to adapt to American rule, Joaquin had embraced the changes brought by California's new status and had invested considerable time and effort in securing legal recognition of his property rights. He had also begun expanding his cattle operation to take advantage of the increased demand for beef from the mining camps, a lucrative business that would have been difficult to abandon voluntarily. A more sinister theory emerged from conversations with some of the more unsavory characters who frequented the gambling halls and saloons of Stockton and Sacramento. These individuals suggested that the Ortegas had discovered gold on their property and had fallen victim to claim jumpers or other criminal elements who wanted to eliminate witnesses to their theft. This explanation seemed supported by the mysterious map found in Joaquin's office, with its pattern of excavation sites that could easily represent a systematic search for mineral deposits. The territorial authorities conducted what passed for an official investigation, but their efforts were hampered by the limited resources available for law enforcement during this chaotic period in California's history. The nearest sheriff was based in Sacramento, more than 60 miles away, and his jurisdiction was largely theoretical in the vast rural areas where established legal systems had not yet taken root. Most of his attention was focused on maintaining order in the rapidly growing settlements where conflicts between miners, merchants, and various criminal enterprises required constant intervention. Deputy Marshal Horatio Buck traveled to the ranch approximately 2 weeks after Judge Kettner's initial discovery, accompanied by a small party of volunteers recruited from the Sacramento settlements. Buck's report, preserved in the territorial archives, provides additional details about the condition of the property and some new information that had not been noted in the judge's initial account. According to Buck's report, the deputy and his party discovered what appeared to be recent excavation sites in several locations around the ranch property, corresponding roughly to some of the X marks on Joaquin's map. The digging was sophisticated, suggesting knowledge of mining techniques rather than random treasure hunting, and some of the sites showed evidence of having found their intended targets. In 3 locations, the searchers had uncovered what appeared to be naturally occurring gold deposits, though the quantities were impossible to determine, since any valuable material had obviously been removed. More troubling was Buck's discovery of what he described as signs of hasty concealment efforts around these excavation sites. Brush had been cut and arranged to hide the disturbed earth, and rocks had been repositioned to mask the evidence of digging. This suggested that whoever had been responsible for the excavation was concerned about being discovered and had taken considerable care to hide their activities from casual observation. The deputy's report also noted that several items were missing from the ranch house that had not been mentioned in Judge Kettner's initial inventory. These included a number of tools that would be useful for mining operations, such as picks, shovels, and pans for separating gold from sediment. Also missing were several lengths of rope, a pulley system that Joaquin had used for moving heavy feed sacks, and a collection of leather bags that could serve to transport valuable materials. Most significantly, Buck reported finding evidence that someone had returned to the ranch since the family's disappearance, and possibly even during the period when the property was supposedly abandoned. In the stable, fresh hay had been scattered in several stalls, and there were recent horse droppings that could not have accumulated during the family's known period of absence. Footprints around the well showed that someone had been drawing water within the previous few days, and ashes in the kitchen fireplace suggested recent use. This evidence led Buck to conclude that whatever had happened to the Ortega family was not a simple case of voluntary departure or random violence. The pattern of activity suggested ongoing use of the property by individuals who had intimate knowledge of its layout and resources, and who were continuing some kind of systematic operation that the family had begun during their final months of residence. Despite these findings, the official investigation was soon abandoned due to other pressing demands on limited law enforcement resources. California in 1849 was experiencing a level of social upheaval that made individual missing persons cases a low priority, regardless of how mysterious their circumstances might be. The Ortega Ranch was officially classified as abandoned property and eventually became part of the complex legal proceedings that would consume California's courts for decades as various parties attempted to establish clear title to disputed lands. In the years that followed the family's disappearance, the ranch property acquired a reputation that discouraged settlement or development. Travelers passing through the area reported unusual sounds coming from the abandoned buildings, particularly during the early morning hours when the valley was shrouded in mist. These sounds were variously described as voices speaking in hushed Spanish, the clang of metal against stone, and occasionally what seemed to be the lowing of cattle from pastures that had long since been abandoned. More disturbing were reports from prospectors who attempted to search the ranch property for the gold deposits that rumor suggested had been discovered there. Several individuals who spent nights on the property described being awakened by sounds of digging and the movement of heavy objects, but when they investigated, they found only empty silence and undisturbed earth. Some reported seeing lights moving through the buildings at night as if someone were conducting searches with lanterns or torches, but again, closer inspection revealed no evidence of recent activity. These reports might easily be dismissed as the product of superstition or the psychological effects of isolation in an unfamiliar landscape. But they were remarkably consistent across different time periods and witnesses who had no contact with one another. More significantly, they were reported by individuals who had practical experience with frontier conditions and were not generally inclined toward romantic or supernatural explanations for unusual phenomena. By 1852, the ranch had become sufficiently notorious that most travelers avoided it entirely, taking longer routes through the valley rather than risk spending a night near the abandoned buildings. This isolation contributed to the gradual deterioration of the structures as weather and neglect took their toll on buildings that had been constructed to last for generations. The Ortega story might have faded entirely into regional folklore, remembered only as another casualty of California's violent transition period, except for a discovery made in 1858 by a geological survey team working in the area. The surveyors were mapping mineral resources for the state government when they decided to make a detailed examination of the abandoned ranch property, which their preliminary research suggested might contain significant gold deposits. Led by a mining engineer named Ezekiel Morrison, the survey team spent several weeks conducting a systematic exploration of the ranch, using more sophisticated techniques than had been available to earlier prospectors. Their work confirmed that the property did indeed contain substantial gold deposits, particularly in the creek bottom and in several natural formations that would have been easy to identify by someone with basic knowledge of mining geology. However, Morrison's most significant discovery was not geological, but historical. While examining one of the excavation sites that had been noted in Deputy Buck's original report, the survey team uncovered a cache of personal belongings that had been carefully buried and concealed. The cache contained items that clearly belonged to the missing Ortega family, including jewelry that matched descriptions provided by contemporary witnesses, personal documents bearing Joaquin's signature, and household implements that corresponded to the inventory of missing items compiled during the original investigation. More intriguingly, the cache also contained what appeared to be a detailed journal written in Joaquin's hand, documenting his activities during the final months before the family's disappearance. The journal provided the first clear explanation for the mysterious map found in the ranch office and offered insights into the family's final weeks that painted a troubling picture of mounting paranoia and fear. According to the journal, Joaquin had indeed discovered gold on his property in early spring of 1849, not through deliberate prospecting, but as the accidental result of repairs to the creek that provided water for his cattle. The discovery had initially filled him with optimism about his family's future prosperity, but his enthusiasm quickly gave way to anxiety as he realized the implications of his find. Joaquin wrote extensively about his fear that news of the discovery would attract the kind of violent, unstable individuals who had been drawn to California by reports of easy wealth. He had seen what happened to other property owners who became known to possess valuable resources, and he was determined to extract the gold quietly while maintaining the appearance that his ranch was simply a cattle operation. This explained the systematic pattern of excavation sites marked on his map, as well as the care taken to conceal evidence of mining activity. The journal also revealed the identity of Joaquin's partners in the mining operation, answering some of the questions that had puzzled earlier investigators. Cornelius Webb, the American who had been living with the family, was revealed to be an experienced miner who had worked in the Georgia gold fields before coming to California. Webb had provided the technical expertise necessary to extract gold efficiently from the ranch property, while Joaquin contributed local knowledge and provided security through his established relationships in the region. Valentin Herrera, the loyal vaquero, had served as a lookout and messenger, using his daily cattle work as cover for monitoring the surrounding area for signs of unwanted attention. His familiarity with every acre of the ranch property and his reputation for absolute discretion made him an ideal collaborator in the clandestine operation. However, the journal's final entries suggested that the partnership was beginning to fracture under the pressure of maintaining secrecy while extracting increasingly large quantities of gold. Webb apparently became convinced that their activities were drawing suspicion from other prospectors in the area, and he advocated for a temporary halt to mining operations until the initial frenzy of the gold rush subsided. Joaquin disagreed, arguing that delay would only increase their risks as more sophisticated mining operations moved into the region and began systematic exploration that would inevitably discover the ranch's resources. He believed their best strategy was to extract as much value as possible as quickly as they could manage, then relocate to a more secure location where they could enjoy their wealth without constant fear of theft or violence. The tension between these conflicting strategies apparently came to a head during the final week documented in the journal. Webb had begun making preparations to travel to San Francisco, where he claimed to have contacts who could help the family establish themselves safely away from the mining regions. Joaquin suspected that Webb intended to abandon the partnership and take his share of the accumulated gold without sharing the risks involved in continued mining operations. Herrera, caught between loyalty to his longtime employer and practical concerns about their security, apparently supported Webb's cautious approach. This created an alliance that isolated Joaquin within his own household and led him to question whether his partners might be planning to eliminate him entirely and claim the ranch's resources for themselves. The journal's final entry, dated November 10, 1849, just 5 days before Judge Kettner discovered the abandoned ranch, consisted of only a few lines written in increasingly agitated handwriting. Joaquin wrote that he had decided to confront Webb and Herrera about his suspicions, and that he intended to demand an immediate division of their accumulated wealth so that each party could go their separate ways. He expressed confidence that this would resolve the growing tensions within the group, but also noted that he had taken precautions in case the confrontation did not proceed as he hoped. Morrison's survey team never located the main deposit of gold that the Ortega partnership had accumulated during their months of mining operations. The journal suggested that the total value extracted was substantial, possibly several $1,000s worth at the prices of the period, but this wealth had apparently disappeared along with the family members themselves. The discovery of the cash raised more questions than it answered, particularly regarding the circumstances under which Joaquin's personal belongings had been buried on the ranch property. If the family had fled voluntarily, as some theories suggested, it seemed unlikely that they would have abandoned valuable items and important documents. If they had been victims of violence, the careful burial of their possessions suggested a level of respect or remorse that would be unusual among common criminals. Morrison included the journal and other materials from the cache in his official report to the State Geological Survey, but these documents apparently disappeared from the state archives sometime during the 1860s, possibly during the administrative reorganization that followed California's admission to the Union. The only record of their contents comes from copies that Morrison made for his personal files, which were discovered among his papers after his death in 1884. The discovery of Morrison's personal copies of the Ortega documents created new interest in the case among both historians and law enforcement officials, who recognized that the journal provided the most detailed contemporary account of events leading up to the family's disappearance. However, by the time these documents became available for examination, most of the original witnesses and participants were either dead or had disappeared themselves, making it impossible to verify many of the specific claims made in Joaquin's journal. One particularly intriguing aspect of the journal that attracted attention from investigators was Joaquin's repeated references to observers who were apparently monitoring the ranch property during the weeks before the family's disappearance. The journal described these watchers in considerable detail, noting their apparent familiarity with surveillance techniques and their ability to remain concealed while maintaining observation of the family's activities. According to Joaquin's accounts, the surveillance began sometime in late September 1849, initially as brief appearances of individuals who might simply have been passing travelers taking shelter in the area. However, as weeks passed, the same figures began appearing with regularity at specific locations around the ranch property, particularly elevated positions that provided clear views of the main buildings and work areas. Most disturbing to Joaquin was evidence that the watchers possessed detailed knowledge of the family's routines and mining activities. The journal described incidents where the observers appeared at precisely the times when mining work was being conducted, and seemed to position themselves to observe specific excavation sites rather than simply watching the ranch buildings in general. This suggested that the surveillance was being conducted by individuals who had prior knowledge of the family's gold mining operations, possibly through information provided by someone with intimate access to the ranch property. Joaquin's journal expressed increasing suspicion that the family had been betrayed by someone they trusted, though he never explicitly identified who he suspected of providing information to their watchers. The journal also documented Joaquin's efforts to identify and counteract the surveillance, including attempts to track the observers to their camp or staging area. These efforts were largely unsuccessful, as the watchers demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of concealment techniques and appeared to be familiar with the terrain around the ranch property. Several times, Joaquin and Herrera followed obvious tracks away from observation positions, only to lose the trail in rocky areas where footprints could not be detected. On one occasion, Joaquin wrote that he had discovered evidence of a temporary camp approximately 2 miles from the ranch house, hidden in a grove of oak trees that provided both concealment and water from a seasonal stream. The camp showed signs of extended occupation by several individuals, with carefully arranged sleeping areas and a fire pit that had been used multiple times over what appeared to be several weeks. Most significantly, Joaquin found evidence at this camp that suggested the watchers were not simple opportunists, attracted by rumors of wealth, but rather organized individuals with access to maps and detailed information about the ranch property. Among the debris left at the campsite, he discovered fragments of paper that included portions of surveys and land descriptions that could only have come from official territorial records or private documents belonging to the Ortega family. This discovery convinced Joaquin that the surveillance operation was connected to broader efforts to challenge his legal title to the ranch property, possibly involving territorial officials or land speculators who sought to claim valuable mining sites through legal manipulation or intimidation. Such schemes were common throughout California during the gold rush period, as established landowners often found their property rights challenged by newcomers who used various legal and extra-legal methods to acquire valuable holdings. Joaquin's journal entries from this period reveal his growing awareness that his family's situation was far more dangerous than a simple case of criminal targeting. If their watchers were connected to organized efforts to acquire the ranch property through legal challenges, then the family's physical safety was threatened not just by random violence, but by calculated efforts to eliminate their ability to defend their property rights. This realization apparently motivated Joaquin's decision to accelerate the extraction of gold from the ranch property despite Webb's arguments for caution. If legal challenges to their land title were imminent, then the family's only hope for preserving their wealth lay in removing as much valuable material as possible before their access to the property could be terminated by court proceedings or administrative action. The journal's final entries document increasingly frantic efforts to locate and extract the largest remaining gold deposits on the ranch property, with work continuing during daylight hours, despite the obvious risks of detection by the surveillance team. Joaquin wrote that he had decided to take these risks because he believed that their watchers already possessed enough information to compromise their security, and that further attempts at concealment would only delay the inevitable confrontation without providing any meaningful protection. However, the acceleration of mining activities apparently created new tensions within the family partnership, as Webb and Herrera became increasingly concerned about their safety and the sustainability of their operations. The journal describes heated arguments about whether to continue mining, how to respond to the surveillance threat, and what plans should be made for protecting the family's wealth and personal safety. These internal conflicts were complicated by practical considerations about the logistics of extracting and transporting large quantities of gold without attracting additional attention from criminals or territorial authorities. The family had accumulated substantial wealth over several months of mining operations, but converting this wealth into a form that could be safely transported and concealed required careful planning and access to resources that might not be available if they were forced to flee the ranch suddenly. Webb apparently advocated for dividing the accumulated gold among the partnership members and dispersing immediately to different locations, arguing that their safety depended on making it impossible for their enemies to target all of the family's wealth simultaneously. He suggested that each partner should leave California entirely, establishing new identities in distant territories where they could enjoy their wealth without fear of recognition or pursuit. Joaquin, however, was reluctant to abandon the substantial property and business interests that he had spent years developing in California. He believed that with proper planning and perhaps assistance from territorial authorities, the family could overcome the immediate threats they faced and continue their life at the ranch. This optimism seems to have been based partly on his confidence in his legal title to the property and partly on his relationships with local officials who had previously supported his adaptation to American rule. Herrera's position in these discussions was apparently influenced by his deep attachment to the ranch property itself and his reluctance to abandon the land where he had spent most of his adult life. Unlike Webb, who had no permanent ties to California, or Joaquin, whose wealth could potentially allow him to establish himself elsewhere, Herrera had few options for supporting himself outside the cattle ranching industry, which required local knowledge and established relationships that would be difficult to replicate in a new location. The journal suggests that these conflicting interests and priorities made it increasingly difficult for the partners to reach agreement on how to respond to their deteriorating security situation. As days passed without resolution of their strategic differences, the surveillance of their property became more obvious and aggressive, with watchers positioning themselves closer to the ranch buildings and apparently making no effort to conceal their presence. According to Joaquin's account, the final crisis began on November 9, 1849, when the family's watchers abandoned any pretense of concealment and approached the ranch house directly. The journal describes this confrontation in terms that suggest it was not entirely unexpected, as if Joaquin had been preparing for this possibility throughout the weeks of surveillance. The leader of the surveillance team was described by Joaquin as a man of medium height with distinctive facial features that included a prominent scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. This individual spoke fluent Spanish and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the ranch property and the family's mining operations, confirming Joaquin's suspicions that their security had been compromised by someone with intimate access to their affairs. The confrontation began as a negotiation, with the intruders demanding access to information about the location and extent of gold deposits on the ranch property. They claimed to represent legitimate business interests that were prepared to offer the family partnership arrangements that would allow them to continue their mining operations under the protection of organized investors who could provide security against criminal threats. However, as the discussion continued, it became apparent that the visitors' true intentions were far more extensive than simple business partnership. They demanded not only access to the family's existing gold reserves, but also exclusive control over all future mining operations on the ranch property, with the Ortega family relegated to the role of supervised laborers working under directions from their new partners. When Joaquin refused these terms, the negotiations quickly deteriorated into threats and ultimatums. The journal's account suggests that the visitors were prepared to use violence if necessary to achieve their objectives, and that they possessed detailed knowledge of the family's daily routines and security arrangements that would make resistance extremely difficult. At this point, Joaquin's journal becomes fragmentary and increasingly difficult to interpret, with entries written in a code or shorthand that apparently referenced previous arrangements or contingency plans that he had discussed with his partners. The journal's final legible entry consists of a single sentence written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Webb was right about everything, and now we must trust his preparations. The meaning of this cryptic statement remained unclear until the discovery of Cornelius Webb's personal papers in 1967, which provided a completely different perspective on the events surrounding the Ortega family's disappearance. Webb's records, written in a detailed private journal that he maintained throughout his time in California, revealed that his background and relationship with the family were far more complex than official records had indicated. According to Webb's journal, he had not arrived in California as a simple immigrant seeking agricultural opportunities, but rather as part of a network of individuals who specialized in providing security and protection services to wealthy property owners during periods of social upheaval. His previous experience in the Georgia goldfields had involved similar situations where established landowners required assistance in protecting their interests against various criminal and legal threats. Webb's journal indicated that his integration into the Ortega household had been arranged through intermediaries who recognized that the family's valuable property and isolated location made them potential targets for the kind of organized criminal activity that was becoming common throughout California during the gold rush period. His role was not simply as a mining partner, but as a security specialist who could help the family protect their wealth and maintain their property rights during the chaotic transition period. This arrangement explained Webb's apparent expertise in surveillance detection and his familiarity with the techniques used by the individuals who had been monitoring the ranch property. His journal revealed that he had identified the surveillance operation far earlier than Joaquin's journal suggested, and had been conducting his own counter-surveillance efforts while developing plans for protecting the family if direct confrontation became necessary. Webb's preparations for the family's security included arrangements for alternative living accommodations outside California, financial instruments that could be used to maintain access to their wealth from distant locations, and contacts within both legitimate business networks and less conventional organizations that could provide assistance during emergency situations. Most significantly, Webb's journal indicated that the confrontation of November 9, 1849, had not been an unexpected crisis, but rather the culmination of a carefully planned operation designed to protect the family's interests while creating the appearance that they had become victims of the criminal violence that plagued the region during this period. According to Webb's account, the family's disappearance was actually an organized evacuation conducted under his supervision, with their apparent abandonment of the ranch property serving as cover for their relocation to predetermined safe locations where they could wait for conditions in California to stabilize sufficiently to allow their safe return. The careful burial of personal belongings and the concealment of evidence about their mining operations were part of this plan, designed to preserve their interests in the ranch property while eliminating traces that could be used by their enemies to track them to their new locations. The systematic nature of these preparations suggested that Webb had been planning for this possibility throughout his time with the family, developing contingency arrangements that could be implemented quickly if their security situation deteriorated beyond acceptable limits. Webb's journal provided detailed descriptions of the evacuation process, including the routes used to transport the family members and their accumulated wealth away from the ranch property, the arrangements made for their temporary shelter and security, and the communication systems established to maintain contact between dispersed family members during their period of separation. According to Webb's account, the evacuation was conducted in multiple stages over several days, with different family members departing the ranch at different times and using different routes to minimize the risk of detection by their watchers. Joaquin and Esperanza left first, traveling south toward Los Angeles, with a substantial portion of the family's gold reserves concealed in modified wagon equipment that had been specially constructed for this purpose. Remedios departed several days later, taking a more northerly route toward San Francisco, where Webb had established arrangements with associates who could provide secure lodging and assistance with converting gold into other forms of wealth that could be more easily transported and concealed. Her role in the overall plan was to establish financial arrangements that would allow the family to maintain their resources during an extended period of exile from California. Herrera's departure was delayed longest, as his responsibilities included conducting final security sweeps of the ranch property and implementing measures designed to conceal evidence of the evacuation from their watchers. His intimate knowledge of the ranch property and his reputation for absolute loyalty made him the ideal person to handle these sensitive final arrangements. Webb himself remained at the ranch until the final stages of the evacuation, maintaining the appearance of normal activity while ensuring that all traces of the family's mining operations and evacuation preparations were properly concealed. His journal indicates that he used his knowledge of surveillance techniques to monitor their watchers during this period, gathering information about their numbers, capabilities, and intentions that could be useful in planning the family's eventual return to California. The confrontation of November 9th, which had appeared to Joaquin as an unexpected crisis, was actually an anticipated event that Webb had been preparing to manage as the final stage of the evacuation process. His journal reveals that he had been in communication with the surveillance team's leaders for several days before the confrontation, negotiating arrangements that would allow him to conclude the family's departure from the ranch without violence or pursuit. According to Webb's account, these negotiations were successful, with his opponents accepting the appearance that the family had been eliminated or driven away from their property in exchange for access to information about the location of some of the less valuable gold deposits that had been discovered during the family's mining operations. This arrangement satisfied the immediate objectives of both parties while preserving the family's safety and their access to the majority of their accumulated wealth. Webb's journal indicates that he departed the ranch property on November 14, 1849, one day before Judge Kettner's arrival, using a carefully planned route that took him to a predetermined rendezvous point where he could begin the process of reuniting with the other family members at secure locations outside California. The success of this evacuation plan, according to Webb's records, allowed the family to establish themselves safely in locations throughout the Western Territories, where they could wait for conditions in California to improve sufficiently to allow their safe return. Webb maintained detailed records of communication with family members during their period of exile, documenting their activities and monitoring political and economic conditions that might affect their ability to resume their life in California. However, Webb's journal also reveals that the family's period of exile extended far longer than originally anticipated, as the social and political chaos associated with California's gold rush period persisted throughout the 1850s. Criminal activity continued to plague rural areas, legal challenges to property rights remained common, and the territorial government proved unable to provide effective protection for isolated property owners like the Ortega family. As years passed without improvement in security conditions, the family members gradually established more permanent arrangements in their places of exile, with some eventually deciding that the risks associated with returning to California outweighed the benefits of reclaiming their ranch property. Webb's journal documents the gradual dissolution of the original plan for return as practical considerations and changing family circumstances made it increasingly difficult to coordinate a safe and successful restoration of their California life. Joaquin and Esperanza apparently established themselves successfully in a small community in Arizona Territory where they used a portion of their California gold to purchase property and resume cattle ranching operations under assumed identities. Webb's records indicate that they maintained this life successfully for several years, but both died of natural causes during the late 1850s without ever returning to California. Remedios used her time in San Francisco to develop business connections that eventually allowed her to establish herself as an independent merchant in Portland, Oregon, where she operated a successful import business that specialized in goods from Mexico and South America. Webb's correspondence with her continued into the early 1860s, but ceased abruptly during the Civil War period, possibly due to the disruption of communication systems or her decision to end contact with associates from her California period. Herrera's fate was more uncertain, as Webb's records indicate that he struggled to adapt to life away from the ranch property that had been his home for so many years. Several attempts to establish him in agricultural work in other territories were unsuccessful, and his correspondence with Webb became increasingly infrequent and despondent during the mid-1850s. The last communication Webb received from Herrera was dated 1857 and consisted of a brief note indicating that he was planning to return to California despite the continuing risks, because he preferred the dangers of his homeland to the certainty of misery in exile. Webb's own activities during the 1850s were focused on maintaining and protecting the family's interests in the California ranch property, while conducting periodic assessments of security conditions to determine whether circumstances had improved sufficiently to allow safe return. His journal indicates that he made several reconnaissance trips to the ranch during this period, using his security expertise to monitor the property without revealing his presence to potential observers. During these visits, Webb documented the gradual deterioration of the ranch buildings and the various attempts by other parties to explore the property for gold deposits. His observations confirmed that the family's mining operations had indeed been extensive and successful, as subsequent prospectors discovered evidence of substantial gold extraction that corresponded to the sites marked on Joaquin's original map. However, Webb's reconnaissance also revealed that the ranch property continued to attract the attention of individuals and organizations who were interested in acquiring access to its mineral resources through various legal and illegal methods. The property's reputation as a source of wealth, combined with the mysterious circumstances of the family's disappearance, made it a target for claim jumpers, land speculators, and criminal enterprises that sought to profit from the chaos surrounding property rights during California's early statehood period. These continuing threats convinced Webb that conditions were not yet safe for the family's return, and he began to develop alternative plans for protecting their interests in the property while maintaining their safety in exile. His journal documents his efforts to establish legal arrangements that would preserve the family's title to the ranch, while allowing him to conduct limited mining operations that could provide ongoing income to support their life in other territories. Webb's success in implementing these arrangements apparently allowed him to extract substantial additional wealth from the ranch property during the 1850s, using sophisticated techniques and equipment that had not been available during the original family mining operations. His journal indicates that this later mining was conducted with extreme caution, using carefully planned operations that minimized the risk of detection while maximizing the extraction of valuable materials. However, Webb's journal also reveals that these later operations eventually attracted the same kind of hostile attention that had forced the original family evacuation. By the mid-1850s, organized criminal enterprises had become increasingly sophisticated in their methods for identifying and targeting successful mining operations, and Webb's activities at the ranch property began to draw surveillance and threats similar to those that had endangered the family in 1849. The escalation of these threats apparently forced Webb to abandon his plans for continued mining operations and to focus instead on preserving what wealth had already been accumulated while ensuring his own safety. His journal's final entries, dated in late 1857, indicate that he was planning to leave California permanently and to join other family members in their places of exile, bringing with him the proceeds from his final mining operations at the ranch property. Webb's disappearance from official records after 1857 suggests that these plans were implemented successfully, though his ultimate fate remained unknown until the discovery of his journal provided evidence that he had survived the dangers of his California period and had been able to reunite with at least some of the other family members in their new lives outside California. The revelation of Webb's extensive records fundamentally changed historians' understanding of the Ortega case, transforming it from a mysterious disappearance into a carefully planned evacuation that had been largely successful in achieving its objectives of protecting the family's safety and preserving their wealth. However, this new understanding also raised troubling questions about the reliability of other historical accounts from California's gold rush period and about the extent to which official records might be incomplete or misleading regarding the fate of families who disappeared during this chaotic time. Dr. Nathaniel Crowley, the historian who had been studying the case since the early 1960s, found Webb's journal both illuminating and deeply disturbing, as it suggested that the territorial authorities' investigation of the family's disappearance had been fundamentally flawed from its inception. The investigators' assumption that the family had been victims of violence or had fled in panic had prevented them from recognizing evidence of the carefully planned evacuation that had actually occurred. More troubling was the implication that other mysterious disappearances during this period might have been similarly misunderstood, with families who had successfully escaped dangerous situations being incorrectly classified as victims of the criminal violence that was indeed common during the gold rush era. This possibility suggested that historians' understanding of the period's social conditions might be based on incomplete or inaccurate information, with successful survival strategies being overlooked in favor of dramatic accounts of violence and chaos. Dr. Crowley's final assessment of the Ortega case, completed in 1969 after his examination of Webb's journal, concluded that the family's story represented a remarkable example of successful adaptation to the extreme conditions that characterized California during its transition from Mexican to American control. Rather than simply becoming victims of the period's violence and upheaval, the Ortegas had developed and implemented sophisticated strategies for protecting their interests and ensuring their survival during one of the most chaotic periods in American frontier history. However, Dr. Crowley also noted that the success of the family's evacuation plan had come at enormous personal and social costs, effectively ending their life as an established California family and forcing them to abandon the property and community connections that had represented the work of a lifetime. The necessity of maintaining secrecy about their survival had prevented them from maintaining normal family relationships and had isolated them from the cultural and social networks that had previously defined their identity. The broader implications of the Ortega case, according to Dr. Crowley's analysis, suggested that the social disruption caused by the gold rush extended far beyond the commonly recognized patterns of criminal violence and economic displacement. Established families like the Ortegas, who had successfully adapted to California's transition from Mexican to American rule, found themselves facing threats that could only be managed through extreme measures that effectively destroyed their previous way of life, even while preserving their physical safety. This pattern of displacement and cultural disruption, Dr. Crowley argued, represented one of the most significant but least documented consequences of the gold rush period, as successful survival strategies required secrecy and isolation that made it impossible for historians to document the experiences of families who had managed to protect themselves from the period's dangers. The final chapter in the Ortega story came with the rediscovery of their original ranch property during the agricultural development of the San Joaquin Valley in the 1960s. When construction crews uncovered the human remains that had been tentatively identified as belonging to the family, forensic examination raised new questions about the identity of these individuals and their connection to the Ortega case. The remains showed evidence of violent death, but their positioning and burial suggested careful treatment that was inconsistent with the kind of criminal violence that had been assumed to be responsible for the family's fate. More significantly, personal items found with the remains included objects that did not match the inventories of the Ortega family's possessions that had been compiled during the original investigation. Dr. Crowley's analysis of this evidence, combined with the information from Webb's journal, led him to conclude that the remains probably belonged to members of the surveillance team that had been monitoring the ranch property during the weeks before the family's evacuation. Webb's journal had mentioned that the final confrontation of November 9th had involved negotiations with these individuals, but had not provided specific details about how these negotiations had been concluded. The careful burial of these individuals suggested that their deaths had not resulted from simple criminal violence, but rather from some kind of conflict or accident that had occurred during the complex arrangements surrounding the family's evacuation. The respectful treatment of their remains indicated that whoever was responsible for their burial had acted with consideration for their dignity, despite whatever conflict had led to their deaths. This interpretation of the evidence suggested that the Ortega family's evacuation had been more complex and dangerous than Webb's journal had indicated, involving confrontations and negotiations that had ultimately resulted in violence despite efforts to avoid such outcomes. The discovery of these remains provided the first concrete evidence of the human cost associated with the family's survival strategy, even though that strategy had ultimately been successful in preserving the lives of the family members themselves. Dr. Crowley's final report on the Ortega case, completed in 1969, concluded that while the basic facts of the family's survival and successful evacuation had been established through Webb's journal and other evidence, many important questions about the specific events of November 1849 remained unanswered and might never be resolved definitively. The complexity of the arrangements involved in protecting the family's safety had required a level of secrecy and misdirection that made it extremely difficult for later investigators to separate fact from deliberate concealment. More broadly, Dr. Crowley argued that the Ortega case demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional historical methods for documenting the experiences of frontier families who faced extreme dangers during periods of social upheaval. The survival strategies that these families developed necessarily involved deception and concealment that could mislead contemporary observers and later historians, making it possible that many similar cases had been misunderstood or overlooked entirely. The implications of this conclusion extended beyond the specific circumstances of the Ortega family to broader questions about historians' understanding of frontier conditions and survival strategies during the American westward expansion. Dr. Crowley suggested that the emphasis on dramatic accounts of violence and failure might have obscured recognition of the sophisticated and successful adaptation strategies that many frontier families had developed to protect themselves during dangerous periods. However, Dr. Crowley also acknowledged that the success of these adaptation strategies often came at enormous personal and cultural costs that were themselves significant historical phenomena deserving documentation and analysis. The Ortega family's survival had required them to abandon their identity as California landowners and to accept permanent exile from the community and property that had previously defined their life, representing a form of cultural death, even while preserving their physical survival. The final disposition of the Ortega case came with the completion of Dr. Crowley's research and the restricted filing of his final report in the State Historical Archives. The sensitive nature of his conclusions, particularly regarding the identity of the human remains and the implications for understanding other disappearances during the gold rush period, led to a decision to limit public access to his findings while preserving them for future researchers who might be able to provide additional perspectives on the case. Today, the site of the original Ortega Ranch is productive agricultural land that shows few traces of the complex events that occurred there more than a century ago. The family's descendants, if any survive, have never come forward to claim their inheritance or to provide additional information about their ancestors' fate, suggesting that the secrecy arrangements implemented during the original evacuation have continued to influence family decisions through multiple generations. The broader lessons of the Ortega case remain relevant for understanding the human dynamics of social upheaval and frontier conditions, demonstrating both the remarkable adaptability that individuals and families could develop when facing extreme dangers, and the enormous personal costs that survival could require, even when protective strategies proved successful. Perhaps most significantly, the case illustrates the limitations of historical documentation in situations where survival itself depends on concealment and misdirection, reminding us that official records and contemporary accounts may provide incomplete or misleading information about the experiences of people who faced circumstances that made conventional responses inadequate for ensuring their safety and preserving their interests. The Ortega family's story ultimately represents both a remarkable example of successful adaptation to frontier dangers and a sobering reminder of the human costs associated with survival during periods of social chaos. Their ability to protect themselves while preserving their wealth demonstrated sophisticated planning and implementation skills. But their success required them to abandon the life they had built and to accept permanent separation from the community and property that had previously defined their identity. Whether their sacrifice was worthwhile depends on perspectives and values that can only be judged by the individuals who faced these impossible choices. What remains clear is that their experience illustrates the complexity and difficulty of survival during one of the most challenging periods in American frontier history, and provides insights into the human dimensions of historical events that are often described only in terms of their political and economic consequences.